It was a cold night when the single dad walked home with a bag of groceries in his hands. He was tired after working all day, but his mind was calm because he knew his little daughter was waiting for him. The streets were quiet. Only the sound of his footsteps and the distant bark of a stray dog followed him. He adjusted the bag in his hand and thought about what meal he could cook for her in the morning. Life was not easy for him, but he carried on, step by step, because she was his world. As he turned near a dark alley, he suddenly heard a faint sound. It was not clear at first, almost like someone whispering or groaning in pain. He froze for a moment, his heart racing. At that hour, nothing good ever came out of an alley. Still, something inside him told him to look. Slowly, he stepped closer, his eyes straining in the dim streetlight. That was when he saw her, a young woman lying on the ground, struggling to breathe. His first thought was fear. He didn't know what had happened. Maybe she was drunk, maybe attacked. But when he came closer, he noticed the dark stain spreading across her uniform. She was a police officer, and she was bleeding badly. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but her voice was too weak. His instincts took over. He dropped the grocery bag and knelt beside her. "It's okay. I've got you," he whispered, though his hands were shaking. He had no training, no idea what to do, but he knew he couldn't just leave her there. Looking around, he saw no one else, no backup, no sirens. Whoever had hurt her was long gone, or maybe still nearby. That thought chilled him, but he couldn't abandon her. With trembling hands, he tore off part of his own shirt and pressed it against her wound. She winced but looked at him with desperate eyes, as if clinging to his presence. He pressed harder, trying to stop the bleeding. The streetlight flickered above, the air heavy with silence, broken only by her shallow breaths. "I can't let you die here," he muttered to himself. His daughter's face flashed in his mind. If she were hurt, he would want anyone to help. That gave him strength. He tried shouting for help, but the street was empty. His only choice was to carry her. Taking a deep breath, he slid his arms under her and lifted her up. She was lighter than he expected, but the weight of responsibility felt crushing. Her blood soaked his shirt, warm against his chest, but he didn't stop. He kept whispering to her, hoping his voice would keep her awake. The hospital was several blocks away, but he knew he had no time to wait for an ambulance. Every step felt endless, his muscles burning, yet he refused to give in. She gasped softly, her head resting against him, but her eyes stayed half open. He could feel her fighting to stay alive. Cars passed by, but no one stopped. To them, maybe it just looked like a man carrying someone drunk or sick. He didn't care what they thought. He walked faster, almost running, his breath coming out in sharp bursts. Finally, the glowing red cross of the hospital came into sight. Relief surged through him, but he kept going, afraid that if he slowed down, she would slip away. Bursting through the emergency doors, he shouted for help. Nurses and doctors rushed to him, taking her from his arms, placing her on a stretcher, and rolling her away. For a moment, he stood there, breathless and stained with blood. His shirt was torn, his hands shaking. He wanted to follow, but someone gently stopped him, asking questions he barely heard. His mind was still with her, wondering if she would survive. He didn't wait for thanks, didn't stay for his name to be written down. When the staff were focused on her, he quietly stepped back, picked up his torn bag of groceries, and left the hospital. The cold night air hit him, but he didn't care. All that mattered was that she was alive, and maybe, just maybe, she would get another chance at life. As he walked back home, the world felt strangely quiet. He thought of his daughter asleep in her bed, safe and warm, not knowing what her father had just done. To him, it was simple. He had seen someone in need and done what he could. He had no idea that the woman he carried through the night would one day return into his life and change it forever. The next morning, the single dad sat at the small kitchen table, watching his daughter eat breakfast. She laughed at something silly, her little hands clapping, when he poured extra honey on her toast. He smiled, but inside his mind was restless. The image of the wounded police officer still haunted him. He could almost feel the weight of her body in his arms, the warmth of her blood on his shirt. He didn't tell his daughter what happened. She was too young, and he didn't want her to worry. For her, it was just another morning. For him, It felt like something inside had shifted. He had walked away from the hospital quietly, but the memory refused to leave him. Later that day, while running errands, he noticed people gathered around a newspaper stand. He stopped for a moment, and that was when he saw the headline, "Brave Stranger Saves Injured Officer's Life." His heart skipped. There was no name, no picture of him, only a description of a man who vanished before anyone could thank him. Still, he knew it was about him. He quickly folded the paper and walked away, not wanting the attention. Meanwhile, in the hospital, the young cop slowly opened her eyes. The bright lights stung at first, but then she saw the ceiling above her and realized she was alive. Nurses moved around, checking her condition. She whispered, "Where is he?" But no one understood. They asked her to rest, but her mind clung to one thought: the man who had carried her, who had whispered to her not to give up. Days passed. She recovered slowly, her body sore, but her spirit more restless. She kept asking the staff about the stranger, but no one had answers. It was like he had appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. That mystery only made her want to find him more. Back in his small apartment, the single dad lived his quiet life again. He cooked meals, packed lunches, helped with schoolwork, and worked late shifts. But deep inside, he felt a strange connection to the woman he had saved. He didn't know her name, didn't know if she was okay, but he hoped she had survived. Sometimes, while tucking his daughter in at night, he found himself whispering a prayer for her recovery. One evening, as he walked home, he noticed a shadow near his door. For a moment, his body tensed, thinking it might be trouble. But when the figure stepped into the light, his heart nearly stopped. It was her, the officer he had saved, now standing at his doorstep, dressed in plain clothes. Holding a small bouquet of flowers, she looked at him with gentle eyes, filled with gratitude. "You carried me that night," she said softly. "You saved my life." He froze, unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to deny it, to keep his quiet world undisturbed. But her eyes told him she already knew. His daughter peeked from behind him, curious about the visitor. The cop bent down with a smile, handing the flowers to the little girl, who giggled shyly and ran inside. They stood there for a moment, the silence thick between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I did what anyone would have done." She shook her head firmly. "No, not anyone. People walked past me that night, but you stopped. You didn't just stop, you carried me, bleeding, for blocks. That wasn't just anyone." He looked away, embarrassed by her words. To him, it wasn't heroism. It was humanity. But to her, it was everything. She asked if she could come in, and he hesitated before nodding. Inside, his daughter immediately began chatting with her, asking questions, showing drawings from school. The cop laughed softly, listening with patience. The atmosphere in the small home warmed quickly, as though she belonged there. They shared tea at the table, and for the first time, he saw her not as a wounded stranger, but as a person strong, kind, and full of life despite the scars. She spoke of her recovery, of the fear she had felt that night, and how his voice had anchored her to life. He listened quietly, sipping his tea, still unsure how such a twist of fate had brought her to his home. When she left that night, his daughter hugged her tightly, surprising them both. The officer promised she would visit again. As the door closed behind her, he stood in silence, staring at the empty hallway. Something stirred in him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. He didn't realize it yet. But her visit wasn't just a thank you. It was the beginning of something new, something neither of them had planned for. The man who thought his life was meant to be quiet and lonely had just opened his door to someone who would soon rewrite his future in ways he never imagined. The days after her first visit felt different in the small apartment. The single dad noticed his daughter asking questions he wasn't ready for. "Will she come again?" the little girl whispered at bedtime, her eyes wide with hope. He only smiled and said, "Maybe," though deep inside, he already knew the answer. A few days later, there was another knock on the door. This time, the sound didn't surprise him. When he opened it, she stood there with a simple smile and a bag of groceries in her hand. "I thought I'd return the favor," she said, holding up the bag. He wanted to refuse politely, but his daughter shouted from the kitchen, "Let her in." And that evening turned into laughter, clumsy cooking, and spilled flour on the counter. The officer helped chop vegetables, and his daughter insisted on teaching her how to make pancakes the special way. With too much sugar, they ended up with a messy kitchen and uneven pancakes, but nobody cared. The room was filled with warmth he hadn't felt in years. After dinner, while the little girl colored pictures on the floor, the dad and the officer sat at the table. She asked about his life, how he managed work, home, and raising a child alone. He answered honestly, speaking of long nights, tight money, and the loneliness that crept in when the house grew too quiet. She listened carefully, not out of pity, but out of respect. Then she shared her own story, her years on the force, the danger she faced, and how she sometimes wondered if anyone would notice if she didn't come home one night. For a moment, their eyes met, both recognizing the quiet struggles in each other. No words were needed. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comforting. From then on, her visits became more frequent. Sometimes she came with books for the little girl, other times just for tea after her therapy sessions. The girl adored her, running to the door every time she arrived. The dad, though reserved, found himself looking forward to those visits too. Her presence filled a space in the home he didn't even know was empty. One rainy afternoon, the officer showed up with a board game. The three of them sat on the living room floor, laughing as the little girl made up her own rules. The dad couldn't remember the last time he had laughed so freely. The sound felt strange in his own mouth, but good, like a part of himself he thought was gone had suddenly returned. Yet, not everything was easy. One evening, after the girl went to bed, he told the officer softly, "You don't have to keep coming here. You've already thanked me enough." She looked at him, her expression serious. "I'm not here out of obligation," she replied. "I'm here because I want to be." Those words lingered in his mind long after she left. He wasn't used to anyone choosing to stay in his life. Most people drifted away after his wife's passing, but she kept coming back. One night, he walked her to the door, and for a moment, neither moved. The rain outside tapped against the windows, and the quiet between them stretched. She gave a small smile and said, "Your daughter calls me her hero, but between us, you're the real one." Before he could answer, she was gone, leaving him with a warmth in his chest that refused to fade. The little girl began drawing pictures, with the officer in them, stick figures holding hands, 3 smiling faces under a sun. When she proudly showed her dad, his throat tightened. Children had a way of seeing truths adults were too afraid to admit. One weekend, the officer invited them to the park, watching her run alongside his daughter, helping her fly a kite. He felt something stir deep inside, a longing he hadn't dared to feel in years, not just for companionship, but for a future that didn't feel so lonely. That night, as he tucked his daughter in, she whispered, "Daddy, I think she's like Mommy sent her." His chest ached at the innocence of her words, but also at how true they sounded. The single dad didn't know where all this was leading. He only knew that the woman he once carried through dark streets was now carrying pieces of his heart without even trying, and she, too, didn't realize it yet. But each visit, each smile, each shared meal was tying her closer to them. Fate had brought them together through pain and danger, but something far stronger was now pulling them forward, something that felt like the start of a new life neither of them had planned. The single dad had learned to live with silence. For years, it was just him and his daughter, and the quiet of the nights was something he got used to. But lately, the silence wasn't so heavy anymore. It was broken by the sound of soft laughter, of footsteps that weren't just his, and the voice of someone who wasn't supposed to be there but somehow belonged. The officer had started visiting more often, sometimes even helping his daughter with homework or showing her how to tie her shoes faster. She brought small things, a pack of crayons, a new storybook, once even a pair of sneakers she accidentally bought in the wrong size, which fit the girl perfectly. These weren't grand gestures, but they carried warmth. The little girl began to look forward to her visits as if she had always been part of their life. Still, the dad kept his guard up. Late one evening, after his daughter had fallen asleep, he found himself sitting on the balcony with the officer. The city lights twinkled below, and the sound of traffic hummed in the distance. She sipped tea quietly before speaking. "You don't let people in easily, do you?" He gave a small shrug. People don't usually stick around. She studied him for a moment, then said softly, "I'm not people." The words lingered in the cool night air, making his chest tighten. Over the weeks, their bond grew stronger, not because of big moments, but through the small, ordinary ones. She started joining them for Sunday breakfasts, flipping pancakes while his daughter chattered nonstop. They watched movies together, sometimes falling asleep on the couch, the little girl tucked safely between them. The apartment, once filled only with duty and routine, was now alive with a rhythm he didn't know he had been missing. But healing was never simple. One night, when the officer thought the little girl was asleep, she sat at the table with her head in her hands. "I still see that alley sometimes," she confessed. "I still hear the gunshots." Her voice cracked as she spoke. The dad didn't know what to say. He wasn't good with words, but he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. It was a simple gesture, yet it was enough to steady her. For the first time, she felt safe admitting her fears, not as a cop, not as someone trained to be strong, but as a human who was still hurting. He, too, shared his pain. Quietly, he spoke of the nights when loneliness crushed him, when he wondered if he was enough for his daughter, if he was failing her by trying to be both mother and father. She listened without judgment, squeezing his hand in return. In that moment, it was clear they weren't just helping each other heal. They were becoming each other's strength. The daughter noticed the changes too. One morning, she climbed into her dad's lap and whispered, "Daddy, she makes you smile more." He couldn't deny it. One afternoon, the officer brought them to the community center where she volunteered. The little girl joined a painting class, and the dad watched her from the doorway, pride glowing in his eyes. The officer leaned closer and said, "You're doing better than you think." He turned to look at her, and for a moment, their eyes locked in a way that made time slow. On another day, when the officer couldn't make it, the girl cried at bedtime. She promised she'd come. She sniffled. Her dad held her close and reminded her gently that promises sometimes bend, but don't break. The next day, the officer showed up with a handmade card for the girl, apologizing with a warm hug. It wasn't just about keeping promises, it was about proving she intended to stay. The bond between them was no longer fragile. It was steady, quietly building into something none of them expected. When she laughed with his daughter, when she listened to him without judgment, when she sat with them in the glow of the television at night, it felt like a family. Yet deep inside, both of them still carried questions they didn't dare ask. Was this temporary? Would the outside world tear it apart? Could something born from chance truly last? One evening, as they walked home together after taking the little girl to the park, the officer glanced at him and said, "You know, maybe fate doesn't make mistakes." Her words hung in the air like a truth neither of them could deny. For the single dad, it was the first time in years that he felt the future wasn't something to fear, but something to look forward to. The seasons slowly changed, and so did their lives. What began with one dangerous night had turned into something none of them had expected. The small apartment that once echoed with silence now carried the sound of shared meals, soft laughter, and the warmth of belonging. The single dad sometimes caught himself pausing in the middle of ordinary moments, like watching his daughter teach the officer how to braid doll's hair, or hearing the officer hum softly while washing dishes. He realized that life had quietly shifted. The heaviness he carried for years didn't feel as crushing anymore. One evening, as they all sat on the floor building a puzzle, the little girl yawned and leaned against the officer's shoulder. "You're like family now," she mumbled sleepily before closing her eyes. The officer froze, her throat tightening. She glanced at the dad, who gave a small, quiet smile. Neither of them corrected the child. Maybe because deep down, they both knew it was true. The officer continued to heal, her body stronger, her steps no longer burdened by pain. Yet the invisible scars remained, the memory of that alley, the sound of gunfire. But now, when those memories came, she had a place to go. Sometimes she would sit on the balcony with the dad in silence, knowing she didn't need to explain. His presence was steady, grounding her more than words ever could. For the dad, the change was different. For years, he believed his life was meant to be small and quiet, defined only by responsibility. But she showed him that life could still hold light, that love didn't have to end with loss. that his daughter deserved not just his care, but the joy of a fuller home. It wasn't some sudden declaration. It was the little things, the way she knew how his daughter liked extra honey on pancakes, the way she scolded him for skipping meals after long shifts, the way her laugh filled spaces he thought would always be empty. Bit by bit, she became part of their days, until imagining life without her felt impossible. One rainy night, when the three of them sat together with a blanket wrapped around them, the daughter whispered, "Daddy, can she stay forever?" The question hung heavy in the room. The officer's eyes widened, and the dad felt his chest tighten. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the woman beside him, her face gentle but uncertain. Later, after the little girl had gone to bed, the dad stood by the window, listening to the rain. The officer joined him, her arms crossed as if bracing herself. "She's just a child," the officer said softly, almost nervously. "She doesn't understand what forever means." He turned to her, his voice low. "Maybe she understands it better than we do." They stood in silence, both realizing that the bond between them was no longer fragile chance. It was something deeper, something neither of them had been searching for, yet had found anyway. Weeks later, they walked together through the park. The little girl ran ahead, her laughter echoing in the air. The dad and the officer walked side by side, their shoulders almost brushing. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked quietly. "All the time," she admitted, "but not with fear anymore. With gratitude." He nodded. "So do I. If I hadn't turned down that alley." His voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. That night, which could have ended in tragedy, had become the thread that tied their futures together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the little girl ran back, grabbing both their hands, tugging them closer. "We're a team now," she said proudly. They both laughed, but neither corrected her, because in her innocent words lay the truth they had been circling around all along. The officer looked at the dad, her eyes soft. "You carried me when I couldn't walk. You gave me a chance to live again." She paused, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's time I carry you too, through whatever comes next." He didn't reply with words. Instead, he squeezed her hand, letting silence speak for him. From that night forward, things were no longer uncertain. The three of them weren't just connected by chance, they were bound by choice, by shared pain, by healing, and by a love that grew quietly, steadily, until it became something unshakable. The single dad once believed his story was only about survival. The wounded officer once thought her story was only about duty. But together, they discovered that stories can be rewritten, and theirs, unexpected, fragile, and beautiful, was only just beginning.